This happened when I was a kid, so some details are fuzzy, but I recall the necessary parts. I grew up in Nebraska and rode my bike to school daily because my parents were always at work. It was simply more manageable that way. We lived in a rural area surrounded by farmland, and my route to school passed through this massive cornfield. Looking back, it wasn't that big, but it seemed to go on forever, especially as a kid. Even though our house was across the field, my parents always said not to cut through the cornfield. They were concerned I would get lost without a cell phone, and I didn't question it. I'd seen how simple it was to lose your bearings in there, so every day, I'd stick to the main road and bike around it. I didn't have many friends close to my house, so I always bike alone. I didn't mind the longer rides. Doing them so frequently helped me develop a love of biking. I'd go for bike rides on weekends, even if I didn't have to. I am trying to remember what day of the week, but I knew it was a weekday because I was biking home from school. I was riding home as usual when the chain on my bike came loose. I'm not sure how it happened, but it just came off ultimately. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get it back into place. My father taught me how to fix my bike, but I needed help to work. I was stuck, and the idea of walking home with my bike in tow sounded terrible. As I previously stated, I did not have a phone then, so I couldn't call my parents for help. I wouldn't ask for a ride from a random stranger passing by. I knew better. I was on my own. That's when I looked over to the cornfield. Walking the usual route home would take forever, but going through the cornfield would save me a lot of time. My parents told me not to go in, but I figured it couldn't be that hard. After all, I only needed to walk straight, correct? So I decided to push my bike into the cornfield, convincing myself it would be a quick shortcut. At first, everything was fine. I found a narrow path between the rows of corn that was clear enough to walk through. The stalks towered over me, and I recall a light breeze that day. Imagine walking through a cornfield as a child. The stalks seem 10 times taller, and everything appears 10 times larger. It began to make me feel uneasy. The corn also blocked out much light, so it was strangely quiet there. I'm not sure why, but I would occasionally look behind me. I'm unsure what scared me, but I remember wanting to leave there soon. After a few minutes, I noticed a faint rustling sound from the corn off the path. I paused and listened, hoping to convince myself it was just the wind. It did not sound like the wind, however. It stopped, but I heard it again as soon as I began walking. This time it was slightly louder and closer. I began to suspect an animal was stalking me, but I had no idea what kind of animal would make such a loud noise. I remember struggling to breathe and wishing I hadn't entered the cornfield. I quickened my pace, walking faster, but didn't want to leave my bike behind. I kept telling myself I was paranoid, but every few minutes the rustling returned, as if whatever it was keeping up with me. Eventually the rustling stopped and I felt a sense of relief. Perhaps 10 minutes passed without any strange sounds. At the next opportunity, I decided to switch rows for safety. I turned a corner and saw a man standing in the middle of the path. He was standing there, arms at his sides and staring at me. He didn't resemble a farmer or someone who belonged out there. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had what appeared to be long scratches on both arms. The marks seemingly etched into his arm defied description. I froze, unsure what to do, but then he spoke. In a low, raspy voice, he inquired whether I was lost. I didn't respond because I was glued to the spot. He then approached me and offered to help me find my way home. I felt like I was in sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. Every instinct in me screamed to flee, but I couldn't. He began walking faster, his hands outstretched toward me, and my legs took over. I dropped my bike and ran as fast as I could. He started chasing me, shouting that he only wanted to help me. I didn't stop running. I could hear him crashing through the cornfield behind me, yelling at me to stop. Occasionally, I'd duck into one of the corn stalks and curl up in a ball with my eyes closed. I attempted to make myself as small as possible. I honestly thought I was going to die. He was holding something that resembled a rope in his hand. As he passed, he murmured, "I'll find him." I will never forget those words for the rest of my life. I stayed hidden for what seemed like hours. My legs were cramping, and my entire body was trembling, but I didn't dare to move until I was sure he had left. When I finally crawled out of the corn and went home, I was shaking so hard that I could barely walk. It was dark by then. I finally found my way home. I dashed inside to see my parents, who were worried sick about where I had gone. I told them everything. My mother was in tears, and my father appeared ready to kill someone. However, that man had long vanished, leaving them little to do. My father went outside to look for my bike, but it was nowhere to be found. A few days later, they got me a new one, and life continued. A few weeks later, something else happened that forced us to leave. One day, I came home from school and found my old bike sitting on the porch, the one I had left in the cornfield. I don't remember who was more terrified, me or my parents. My parents no longer felt safe with me in that house, so we quickly moved out. My parents don't talk about what happened, but I don't think I'll ever forget it. Story 2. I was 28 years old and had attempted to pursue my dream of becoming an author by writing for a popular newspaper, but things did not go as planned. I just returned home to help my aging parents on the family farm. It wasn't what I had envisioned for myself after leaving home years ago, but they were getting older, and managing the house independently was becoming more complex. The farm was quiet and isolated, surrounded by vast cornfields that stretched for miles in all directions. The nearest neighbor lived about a 10-minute walk away on a small farm run by an elderly woman who had lived there since her husband died a few years before. Life was slow out there, and I didn't mind it. At that point in my life, slow was exactly what I desired. For about a week or two, everything was pretty standard. I was getting used to the routine of running the farm, and the slower pace of life was highly beneficial to me. I had much free time, so I spent most nights thinking and writing. I'm unsure, but I'm still trying to figure out why. I'm most productive and creative at night, so I took advantage of it. I'd finish the farm chores before the sun went down and then sit at my computer until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I'd decided to stay in the tiny bedroom on the 3rd floor so I wouldn't bother my parents with my strange sleeping habits. I liked it up there. It was cozy and quiet, and the window provided a stunning, muse-like view of the farm. But after about a week, I started to notice something odd. Every evening just before sunset, I saw a figure standing on the far edge of my parents' cornfield between 2 rows of corn. At first, I didn't think much about it. I assumed it was someone from the neighbor's farm, perhaps checking on their property or surveying the crops. They weren't on my parents' property, so they weren't trespassing or doing anything illegal. It was just odd, though. The figure did not move or make gestures. It stood there, almost like a scarecrow or mannequin. I could not tell whether it was a man or a woman. I couldn't know if they were facing me. It was unsettling, but I decided not to worry. Despite the eeriness of the situation, I realized that the scene would make an excellent photograph, a shadow against the golden backdrop of the evening sky and fields of corn that stretched forever. A few more days passed, and the figure kept appearing at the same time and place, just standing. One night, I paid close attention to ensure it wasn't a scarecrow. Finally, I noticed it move, confirming that it was a person. It was strange, but I kept convincing myself that it was harmless. I even suspected it was the neighbor, an elderly woman my mother frequently mentioned. I hadn't seen her since I returned, but perhaps she had a reason for being near our property. In any case, an elderly woman was only capable of causing so much harm. It's not as if she threatened my parents or their property. Of course, if that were the case, I probably wouldn't be writing this down. In retrospect, being so casual about the situation was perhaps unwise. Things began to change over the next few days. Every night, the figure grew closer. I'd see it between 2 different rows of corn, always near the house. It was still silent and motionless, but it was getting closer every night, I was sure of it. I couldn't tell much from that distance, but things were getting serious. Whoever was out there was deliberately moving closer to my parents' property. After 2 nights like this, I realized I needed to do something. The following day, I told my parents what I had been noticing over the previous few weeks. My mother dismissed it, saying it was most likely the neighbor's son. whom she described as an oddball. To call him an oddball was an understatement, but my mother always wanted to put it nicely. To my surprise, they did not appear concerned or even weirded out. They said I should just let him be because he's harmless. One evening, while working late in the barn, I looked to the edge of the field and felt my stomach drop. The figure was no longer at the far edge of the cornfield. It was now standing just outside the property line, much closer than before. A cold chill ran through me. I wiped my hands on my jeans and, feeling uneasy and frustrated, decided to approach it. I needed a better look. I approached the edge of the field and shouted, "Who's there?" But as soon as I approached, the figure turned and dashed between a row of corn. I went to chase it, but as I turned the corner, I saw him dive into a row of corn and vanish from sight. My heart was racing as I stood there scanning the field, but there was no way I could find him. It wasn't as if I would start searching through the corn stalks. I was really freaked out at that point. Even if that was a troubled kid, I didn't think I'd be comfortable having him on the property. I went to my neighbor's farm the following day, hoping to clear things up. When the old woman answered the door, I asked her directly, without sugarcoating the situation. When I told her what was going on, she looked baffled. She shook her head slowly, explaining that she hadn't been outside after dark in weeks due to her health. She told me she could barely move, let alone walk to the edge of her property. I asked her about her son. She informed me that he had left home years ago and had not lived with her since. I froze when she told me that. I could feel my skin starting to itch. The person I had chased the day before wasn't her son. He was a complete stranger. I left her farm with an increasing sense of dread. Whoever or whatever was lurking near the cornfield was not from her area. I immediately informed my parents about what she had told me, and they became concerned. My mother suggested calling the police, but my father said it would be a waste of time because they hadn't done anything illegal. My father instructed me to stay awake and wake him if that person returned, which I agreed to. For the next few days, nothing happened. The figure seemed to vanish, which was a relief. Perhaps they noticed me confronting my neighbor, or they simply chose not to return after being pursued. Regardless, I was relieved. Later that week, everything went dark as I finished some chores in the barn. When I say dark, I mean it. The entire farm was suddenly plunged into darkness, and the power went out without warning. All of the lights inside and outside the house flickered off. I never carried my phone with me in the barn, so I was completely blind. My heart began racing. I suspected I knew what had caused the outage. I fumbled in the darkness for the flashlight I knew was nearby. After finding it, I dashed out of the barn and toward the house, only to halt. I wanted to run inside, but I knew it was a cowardly thing to do. I heard it when I was about to run around the house to check the circuit breaker. There was a faint rustle coming from the cornfield. The realization hit me. That person was on my property, within feet of me. I turned and swept the beam of my flashlight across the field, attempting to remain as quiet as possible. For a moment, nothing happened except the same rustling sounds. But then, out of my eye, I saw movement. I jumped and shakily directed my light toward the source. A man stood a few feet from the barn. I could see it now. The man had a few patches of hair on his otherwise bald head. He was wearing overalls and staring at me with a menacing expression. I looked down at his hands. He was holding a rusted garden tool. Fear gripped me and I fled. To my horror, I heard him start to chase after me. I sprinted into the cornfield, hoping to lose him there. I turned to see him in full pursuit, sprinting as fast as he could. I turned a corner, fell, and dove into a row of corn before he noticed. I sat there, my heart racing, trying to drown out the sound of my breathing. It took a few seconds before I saw that guy run past me. It was the scariest moment of my life. I wanted to dash for my phone and call the cops, but I was too terrified. I sat silently for a few minutes, thinking about the situation and my life. Eventually, I left my hiding spot and returned to the house, which was still completely dark. I called the police and woke up my parents. The police searched the property but found nothing. They did, however, identify the cause of the outage. Someone had dumped a bucket of water on our breaker, which tripped the entire system. The next day, I helped my parents install additional security measures and even warned the neighbor to be cautious. It was just another month on the farm, but nothing happened. It killed me to leave my parents alone.